Hey everybody! This week I wanted to take a little break from these long, heavy video essays I've been doing and show you guys my video game collection. Well, part of my collection. I actually own way too much stuff to fit in a single 15-minute video. My collection is an odd one, not necessarily an impressive one. I don't have a lot of the typical classic games that collectors tend to go for. What I do have is a lot of strange, random junk. I've ended up with a lot of weird stuff over the years, and I think it might be fun to look through some of it together and share some of the stories of how or why I ended up with the games and systems that I have. Growing up, I was the only gamer in my family, so none of us are really savvy about what games were out there, so it wasn't until I had my own income much later in life that I started experimenting with and collecting a lot of the games that I missed out on back in the day, or titles that I'd rent from the video store and didn't own my own copy of. I've always had kind of a fascination with older games. Something about them just calls to me. Maybe it's the way that games are limited by older technology that piques my imagination. Maybe it's the way older games are designed to be more self-contained little adventures, and the systems behind them are more transparent and easy to understand. Maybe I just sort of fit into the lonely kid demographic developers of older games had in mind, as a single-player hermit who is allergic to social features. The other nice thing about older games is when I first had my own income and started collecting in 2010 to 2011, there wasn't a lot of demand for them, and it was really easy to get lots and lots of games and systems for not much cash if you knew where to look. A lot of my collection ended up the way it did, just trying to make a little money go a long way. There's also the fact that I've been making video game content for the last 14 years, so some of the stuff I got for videos that I either made or didn't make, it's a weird hodgepodge of stuff. So without further ado, let's explore my strange cave of wonders. By the way, speaking of wonders, the first thing I want to show off is this marvelously cute, one-of-a-kind Tama plush. Why is it one of a kind? Because we have to hit our goal in order for more to be produced. So y'all remember how I talked about Bandit being my favorite Pokemon? How I've basically loved stuffed animals my whole life? It's kind of a full circle moment for me having a plush of me exist in the world. And not only that, such a stinking cute one. Thankfully you all have given us a great start by getting to almost a quarter funded in just a few days. But we can't stop until we're all the way there, or the plush isn't produced and everyone is refunded and my hopes and dreams are crushed. So check in the video description below for more info and to snag one of these ooh small soft beans for yourself before it's too late. Anyway, the one that started it all for me seems like an appropriate place to start showing my collection. I'm happy to say that I do still have my original lime green Game Boy Color, my very first gaming system ever. It's a little worse for wear, the speaker doesn't work anymore, and it's actually the permanent home of this Pokemon Silver, since when I changed the battery I used the wrong size, and now if the card is put under any pressure at all, the contacts come loose and the save file is wiped. So for safekeeping, it now lives inside this system for protection, and as gently as possible is sometimes removed so that I can back up the save file on this handy monster brain. This thing is a third-party accessory that makes memory backups for Game Boy games, and I use it whenever I play the OG Pokemon games, which is still pretty often. In fact, I'm currently towards the end of a pretty lengthy Pokemon Crystal run that started way back in 2017, and I invested in a custom backlight Game Boy Color for more effective mobile shiny hunting. Unfortunately, I bought this thing just before the mod that doesn't use the cut-up SP screen took off, so sadly I can't ever make further modification to it since it's glued shut where the screws that would go through the screen would be. Over the last 3 years of intense egg hatching, the D-pad has already started to warp, and it'll have to stay that way since popping in a new D-pad is not at all simple. This baby is still pretty though. It has a nice glass screen resistant to scratching, and it even glows in the dark. Eventually, I also plan to use this Game Boy USB smart card to move my crystal save up to the Virtual Console version, and then eventually migrate my cart crystal Pokemon all the way up to Sword and Shield, because I'm insane like that. In terms of other Game Boy Color systems, I've got my sister's old Atomic Purple she barely used, meaning it's in pretty great condition aside from a little crud under the D-pad, and this other Pokemon Special Edition that I got secondhand in okay shape, and I submitted it to the Portland Retro Gaming Expo's Pokemon exhibit last year. Not all that impressive, but each of these systems has character and I like that about them. As you might guess, I've ended up with several copies of most of the Pokemon Game Boy games at this point in English and Japanese, some in box, some loose, some in nice condition, and others not so much. These English Game Boy Color boxes for Gold, Silver, and Crystal I actually bought by themselves in 2013 when I decided for some reason that having really beat up box copies was still better than having no box at all. I think I also got this one for Link's Awakening DX at the same time, but it's in such rough shape that I just keep it tucked away somewhere. The standalone boxes were cheap and I still had all the inserts and manuals, so combined with the loose cards I already have, you could be charitable and call them complete in box. The only English game I got complete in box when I bought it was this puzzle challenge. Many of my Japanese box games were gifted to me by viewers way back when I did my mailbag show. In this copy of Yellow, Chaz bought it at an anime convention in Florida and got it signed by Veronica Taylor, the original voice of Ash Ketchum. The more worn out copies here are the ones I grew up with, and I may have torn the labels off thinking I might be able to hide what I was playing from the people who bullied me. Turns out that was misguided, as there are not a lot of other bright red and blue Game Boy games. One of these copies of Pinball was my first video game ever, but I'm sorry to say I don't actually know which one. Speaking of complete in-box games, I ended up with this complete copy of Nsync Get to the Show. Way back in 2006, I was in a Rite Aid in Southern California, and they had this little clearance rack of old games. Most of them were PS1 and PS2 sports games, but there was also this new in-box copy of Nsync Get to the Show. I was kind of mesmerized to find it there, 5 years after it was released, and 2 years after the Nintendo DS had come out. So here was this game, 2 console generations behind and still in the wild in shrink wrap, and in a Rite Aid no less, which doesn't even usually carry games. Of course I had to snag it up, so it's one of the weirder things that I have in my collection now. I did almost cover it in my Big Games for Girls video a few years ago, but I ended up cutting it as there wasn't much to say that lended itself to the overall point of the video beyond how bizarre the game itself was. Another weird in-box game I've got is the Sailor Moon R game. The interesting thing about it is the difficulty settings. Easy mode is called girl mode and hard mode is called boy mode. So much for a GFG, right? A good chunk of my Game Boy Color stuff found its way into my collection because of that video, like these Mary-Kate and Ashley games, or other videos, for example these Powerpuff Girls games. I did have Bad Mojo Jojo and Paint the Townsville Green as a kid, but I eventually got rid of them over the years and had to get new copies for the review. Ironically, the only one I didn't have back then, Battle Hymn, I now have 2 copies of, as the first one I got crashes at the Rainbow the Clown boss fight and displays the error message, "This game is intended for use on the Game Boy Color." Also strangely, these games had 2 releases, one with a save battery and one without, and some of the passwords I needed to show off in the video only work on early versions with batteries. So I have 4 of them now, and if I ever need to revisit them again for some reason, I should be covered. I also got the Snow White game thinking that someday I might follow up on the Disney games video I did and focus on Disney Princess titles, but there are just so many that I sort of shelved that idea for the time being. As much as I love old tech, there are downsides, and one of them is how high maintenance older games are. These save batteries are really quite a pain for someone who regularly revisits Game Boy Color stuff. There's so many that I want to play and replay, but in order to do that I have to bust them open with these special screwdrivers and replace the batteries. I finally got a copy of Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons, for example, from Chaz's brother, and I really want to try it out. And I also found myself wanting to replay this Hamtaro game again recently now that I have this fancy system to run these games in. But even if the process of replacing the battery isn't hard, it is nerve-wracking every time, and I always worry that I'm going to break these games that I care so much about. Even games that you wouldn't think need a save battery use one, like Wario Land, which by the way is one of my favorite platformers on the system and is really underrated. Another thing is worrying about needing to preserve the save data or just being okay with all of my effort disappearing in 7 years or so. It's one of those things that makes old games like this kind of liminal. And since they've always been comforts to me, the thought of them losing their memories over and over is kind of sad. I won't forget them, but they forget me in a way. Of course, if I'm really worried about it, I do now have the technology to keep their records preserved. It's just still the sort of thing that makes the time you do spend with these games more meaningful. You have to get while you can out of them now before the batteries die and need to be replaced again, so you really gotta savor every moment. There are of course plenty of games in here that I have no desire to replay whatsoever. I still have my original copies from when I was a kid of Earthworm Jim Menace to the Galaxy and of course Rugrats Totally Angelica. Neither of them have save batteries, but even if they did, they would certainly not be worth maintaining. As the only gaming child in a completely non-gaming household, most of the games I'd get back then would come as presents over the holidays, and usually would come from relatives who didn't know anything about games, and would do their best to try to get me games that I might like based on IPs that they knew I was into. Yes, strangely, Earthworm Jim does slot into that category too, since there was a pretty good cartoon on TV I grew up watching. I had several more bad Rugrats games for this system growing up, one of which I think I traded to someone in middle school for a copy of Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Advance. Just about the only game besides Pokemon for the system I grew up with and enjoyed was Kirby Tilt and Tumble, another game I've made a video about. I actually found a Japanese copy of Tilt and Tumble in a thrift store when I visited Japan a few years ago. Secondhand games in Japan are dirt cheap. I'm talking pennies. It seemed like a cool novelty to find this game I loved there, so I picked it up. I also got this bizarre Tamagotchi cart while I was there that I probably should investigate and maybe make a video about because it's just so weird looking. Speaking of Japanese games, when I was in my senior year of high school, I discovered that Japanese carts were also dirt cheap online. So wanting to expand my Game Boy collection for not a lot of money and looking to try out some cool new games, I bid on and won a lot of Japanese Game Boy and Game Boy Color games on eBay. I think it was like $11 for 10 games. It was a really great deal. I didn't actually get to try many of them for real until I went to college and studied Japanese enough to understand them. Like this game, Pia Carrot e Yokoso 2.2. It's a dating sim on the Game Boy Color, and although I was originally curious that there would be actual ecchi stuff in it for the novelty of seeing adult content on a Game Boy Color screen, it seems pretty tame. It's also pretty fun, and has a lot of great bug-eyed girls in it, so if you can read Japanese, I definitely recommend it. I used to have a copy of this one in English, Dragon Quest Monsters, which is like if Dragon Quest and Pokemon had a nice little baby. Dragon Quest and Pokemon have a really interesting relationship actually, since so much of the original game design for Red and Green was inspired by games like Dragon Warrior 3. You could call Dragon Quest Pokemon's grandpa in a way. By the way, there are so many hamster games on the Game Boy in Japan, it's like its own genre. Actually I don't think this one belongs in there. I still have yet to play some of these. If they're really interesting, I'll let you know. There are only 3 games in here that I don't remember getting at all or why I have them. Just no recollection whatsoever. So now that we have games and systems out of the way, let's spend a brief moment on accessories. It wouldn't be a Nintendo system without lots of nice little pricey peripherals with limited utility. Starting off, I actually have 2 link cables, one normal, standard, run-of-the-mill variant, and another with Pikachu molded on. Take a look at this strange early era box art. If I didn't know better, I would guess it was a bootleg or something. With this cable, you can of course link up and play with a friend, or you can connect to the Game Boy printer, a peripheral that prints on thermal paper, which I for some reason also have a box of refills for. It doesn't work so good. It would work better if I changed the roll, but frankly I never use this thing, so it would be an enormous waste of time and paper. The only thing this is really good for is printing some obscure things in Gen 2 games, or printing out pictures you took on your Game Boy camera. At Portland Retro last year, as part of the Game Boy exhibit, they had a Game Boy camera hooked up to an actual photo printer, and turned it into a cool pop-up photo booth. The stuff people can do these days with old tech is fascinating. Finally, what is a mobile console without carrying cases? This one I actually got and used back in elementary school, and this other one I got still in the shrink wrap at a convention several years ago, and although I love the aesthetic, I have not unwrapped it yet. My collecting habit slowed down a lot once I moved out on my own and began the millennial life of living in apartments and moving all the time. Space became much more of an issue, and about the 3rd time you moved, you start worrying about the next time you'll have to move, and how much stuff you'll have to pack. So for now I've switched to digital media for the most part and stopped shopping for new old games on the regular. I also have less time than ever to spend an afternoon exploring old novelties like I used to when I was younger, but maybe someday when I'm finally stable, I can grab some of those titles I've always dreamed of and relax playing Game Boy the way I always used to. Don't forget to grab your limited edition Tama plush down below and tune in next time when we move on to another era and look at more games in my collection. See ya!